Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Crumbling the Supercookie and Other Ways the FCC Protects Your Internet Traffic. We're in South Seas IJ with Travis LeBlanc and Jonathan Mayer. Before we begin, a few brief notes. Stop by the Business Hall located in Bayside AB. The Black Hat Arsenal is on the Palm Foyer on level 3, and of course the Arsenal reception at 5. If you haven't picked up your merchandise today, is your last chance to visit the Black Hat Swag and Bookstore. Visit the Kali Linux Lab in Mandalay Bay A. And thank you for putting your phone on vibrate. It makes it easier for the rest of us to ignore the ringing while you wait for your voicemail to pick up. And there you go.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Travis LeBlanc. I am the Chief of Enforcement at the Federal Communications Commission. I am joined today by Jonathan Mayer, who is our Chief Technologist in the Enforcement Bureau. Thank you for coming to our talk. I know that we are stopping you from the receptions that are going to take place right after this, but we promise to have some really interesting and cool information to share with you about the work that we're doing at the Federal Communications Commission. You'll have to forgive me for wearing my friendly FCC hat up here. It's the closest I could find on government funds to a black hat. But more importantly, it helps me with these lights, which I am able to shield out so that I can see all of you. I am going to chat with you a little bit today, along with Jonathan, about the FCC in general, the work that we're doing, and in particular some of the enforcement actions that are here, as we're going to talk to you about Crumbling the Supercookie and the other ways the FCC protects your security and privacy.
So I'm Jonathan. I'm on loan to the FCC from Stanford. And part of my aim in presenting to you today is to persuade you that the FCC has gotten kind of cool. And so you might have heard of sort of the old FCC, the stuff that the agency used to be a little more focused on. So for instance, it picked a bit of a fight with Eminem. You may remember his lyric on point. Or there was a sort of memorable exchange with the creators of the TV show Family Guy. They did a little song about the FCC. So the FCC used to have a sort of focus on those types of controversies, and again, my hope is to persuade you that the new FCC is a lot cooler than that. We're not too cool, though. So for instance, here's the actual entrance to FCC headquarters right now. There's like a Pokemon Go what did you catch board. And to add like extra dorkiness to it, you can see some folks caught an unlicensed broadcast station are over on the side, the chairman of the agency and one of the commissioners. So we're not that cool. But my hope is to persuade you that we've gotten a lot cooler than we used to be. So at a high level, the FCC is the federal regulatory agency for communications infrastructure and services. And that includes being the regulatory agency for communications, security, and privacy. The way the federal government is structured for addressing security and privacy is a little unusual. We have sector-specific regulators. And so here are some examples of them on the left, by no means an exclusive list. We work on communications security and privacy. The Department of Health and Human Services addresses medical security and privacy. Our colleagues at the FAA work on airplane security and privacy. Department of Education deals with educational record security, privacy, and so on. And then over to the right, the FTC has really been a thought leader in this space. It has authority to address unfair and deceptive business practices, which can include security and privacy issues. It also has some authorities around children's security and privacy and financial security and privacy. So a little different, for those of you who might be from outside the United States, a little different from how some other countries have addressed these issue areas. We don't have a sort of unified data protection regulator. Again, sector-specific. So there are three topics we'd like to move through today. The first one is an overview of the agency, the structure of the place, its authorities, and how it acts. Then we'd like to talk through some of our recent enforcement actions, many of which have been in the news. And we'd like to close by looking at some of the work in progress, because we've got some pretty exciting stuff coming up in the hopper. So I'm going to turn it back over to Travis to give an overview of the agency.
Thanks, Jonathan. This is what I like to think of as sort of just FCC 101 for those who may not be intimately familiar with the Federal Communications Commission or the structure of regulatory bodies in the United States. The FCC is an independent agency. And what that generally means is that the heads of the agency, while appointed by the President of the United States, can't ultimately be removed by the President. As an independent agency, the FCC's authority is established by Congress. Our authorizing statute is called the Communications Act. It's located within Title 47 of the United States Code. That is the source of all authority for every action that the Commission takes. The leadership of the Commission is it's led by 5 individuals who are appointed by the President and confirmed by the United States Senate. At least 3, no more than 3 of which can be from any one party, meaning it's inherently a bipartisan leadership structure that we have. The decisions of the FCC, whether they are regulatory in nature or adjudicatory in nature, are ultimately reviewed by the courts in the United States and the Supreme Court. As an independent agency, the FCC independently proposes, enacts, and enforces its rules. Generally, the way our process works is that whenever the Commission decides to tackle an issue, and it can do that by having an outsider file a petition to request a rulemaking, or it can do it by the Commission of its own volition deciding to pursue an issue, we put out a proposal. That proposal for a rulemaking is publicly available, and the public has an opportunity to comment on it. Once we receive those comments, the Commission votes to issue a final order, which are the actual regulations. We can begin, as they're implemented and going into effect, we can begin enforcement of those as well. But what's neat about the agency is it's one that not only proposes rules, but it enacts the rules and it enforces them. In many ways, it shares a lot of the authority of all the branches of the U.S. government because it has a legislative, executive, and a adjudicative function. Most of the federal government works for this fine gentleman, the President of the United States. But we at the FCC actually work for that dapper group of commissioners. There are 5 of them, as I mentioned before. They are, as I mentioned, appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate of the United States. They can only be removed for cause. And what I'm going to do now is turn it back over to Jonathan, who is going to talk to you a little bit about some of the technologies that we regulate.
So within the Communications Act, there are certain classes of technology that the FCC regulates. So here are some of the biggies. They're not the only ones, but ones that we deal with quite often. The FCC regulates radio and everything else that uses radio frequency spectrum. The FCC regulates telephones, both wireless and, if you happen to still have one, wireline. Regulate television over broadcast, cable, fiber, satellite, and whatever comes next. And most recently, the Commission's had quite a focus on internet service. Cable, DSL, or fiber to the home, also wireless service on your phone. So I want to focus in just a little bit on the internet service because the structure of the Commission's authority is a little unique, and the controversy around that authority has been quite high profile. So here's sort of the textbook network architecture for some consumer using their laptop and communicating with some online service. Of course, the internet's gotten far more complicated than this. This is sort of the trivialized example. So they have some access internet service provider, residential or wireless, that they use to handle their traffic. That ISP in turn hands off traffic to a backbone ISP, hands off traffic to some other backbone ISP. Traffic then goes on to a transit ISP providing service to a business, and finally the online service gets the traffic, and you have your reverse path back to the consumer. So the FCC has really been focused on the access internet service provider market in the green box over there. Let me explain why the FCC has been so focused on that specific part of the internet infrastructure. Broadband ISPs have some distinctive traits. They're gatekeepers to the internet for most Americans. So most Americans have some sort of service that they subscribe to. Most Americans, at least for wireline, only have one option for high-speed service. So competition is not where it could be. These companies have a unique ability to affect network performance. They can speed things up and slow it down. And that in turn can impact innovation economics. If they favor a specific company or disfavor a specific company, that can tilt the playing field for online services. ISPs also have a unique role in network security and privacy. They handle all of a customer's internet traffic, have the ability to look at all of a customer's internet traffic. And so it's kind of a unique vantage point and set of risks. And last but not least, ISPs are increasingly converged providers for a range of communication services. Increasingly, the same company that provides you your internet at home also provides you phone service, also provides you TV service, and the list keeps growing. And that information can be commingled, can be at risk in similar ways. And so for those reasons, we've really zoomed in on the access ISPs. And the debate came to a head fairly recently over an issue called net neutrality, which I suspect most of you have heard of. It played out quite a bit on TV, on the internet, kind of every other medium. And let me explain a little in detail what the net neutrality issue was about from the sort of Communications Act perspective. So there was a dispute over which part of the Act the Commission should use for regulating access internet service providers. And the two options in a rough sketch were Title I, which deals with information services, and Title II, which deals with telecommunications carriers. And roughly speaking, the Commission has much more authority for services that are within Title II. And so the debate was about whether access internet service providers should be moved into the Title II category when previously they'd been in the Title I category. Ultimately, the Commission concluded they should be relocated into Title II. And effective mid-2015, the Commission set out new rules for access internet service providers, commonly known as net neutrality rules. In Commission lingo, they're called open internet rules. Something I've learned as a computer scientist working in the government, everything gets rebranded. So network neutrality is open internet. An access ISP is a broadband internet access service, or BIAS. There's just a whole different lingo about this whole thing. So here are the rules. First up, no blocking of lawful services. Right? You want to go to a website, use an app, your ISP can't stop you from doing that. Similarly, no throttling. If throttling were to the point, very, very slow connectivity, could be effectively blocking, and of course can imbalance the innovation online in that someone, let's say, who wanted to come up with a competitive video service might not be able to make that service work if their traffic were throttled. So very important to put that rule in. So that's the no slow lanes rule. Its corollary was the no fast lanes rule, or no paid prioritization. Again, this recognition that internet economics could be really imbalanced if a company could buy its way into a better ability to communicate with customers. And then there is a general conduct standard, recognizing those three bright line rules might not catch everything that could significantly alter the playing field. So in addition to no blocking, no throttling, no paid prioritization, also no unreasonable interference or disadvantage. So that's the notion behind that rule. And then an enhanced transparency rule, the idea being that an ISP has to give customers adequate information to make informed choices about service, and also has to give them accurate information about their service. So those are the rules that came into effect in mid-2015. More recently, early 2016, the Commission proposed rules specific to security and privacy, addressing conditions under which ISPs maintain customer data and choices around that. We're going to touch on the security and privacy rules a little bit later. So that's sort of the rule landscape. The Commission's rules on most major issues do get challenged in court. And the courts have an important role in reviewing the rules to make sure they're consistent with the Communications Act And so just about a month and a half ago, the DC Circuit released a lengthy opinion reviewing the Commission's open internet rules, and the panel concluded the commissions were consistent with the Communications Act, sustained the rules, and so net neutrality is clearly the law of the land. In computer science terminology, or something like it, we got the check. Okay, so there's an overview of the FCC's authority and its process. Now I'm going to hand the podium back over to Travis to talk about some of our enforcement actions.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm going to talk a bit about the security and privacy and high-profile security and privacy enforcement actions that we've recently taken. I think a number of them will be of particular interest to this group. We've also thrown in one or two that aren't about security and privacy, but we think that this group of folks will probably be very interested in. So please excuse me for cheating you for just a little while, but I think you will find them entertaining, if not informative. The first one that I want to talk to you about is the so-called Verizon Supercookie. And many of you may be aware that a few years ago, Verizon began to deploy a targeted advertising program that allowed the company working through with some of its partners to effectually better track the browsing activities of its subscribers. This was concerning to the FCC because we have a rule on the books that requires an ISP to provide its customers with sufficient information about its network practices so that they can make an informed choice about which provider they want to choose between. This technology, I think it's probably helpful to walk through how Verizon intended for this business model to work. Step one is a subscriber's browser or app sends HTTP requests. This is normal. I mean, all of our phones do this anytime that we browse the web or use an app. Those requests go through Verizon, which would then insert a unique identifier as an additional HTTP request header, effectively allowing Verizon or anyone with access to the header to know uniquely who the origin of this traffic came from. That information is then, as the consumer or subscriber visits various websites, it's then passed on through to a third-party advertising exchange, which receives the header information and then forwards it on to data brokers that may be participating in that exchange. Those data brokers who now are able to see the header information will then use that to match it with data from Verizon. It may be demographic data, such as it's a male between the ages of 20 and 30. It may be geolocation information that Verizon just provides about the header. But now, as a data broker, you have the ability to not only know basic general demographic information, but also know particularly where this demographic is browsing on the web. That information is then used to put together to target advertisements directly to consumers, and of course, at the end of the day, everybody gets a little bit of money. Verizon gets some compensation. The data brokers, the exchanges, make a little money as well as the ads are served. We learned about this through both complaints as well as a number of news articles that came out about the Supercookies. And here was our concern in the Enforcement Bureau. Verizon began its UIDH program in around December of 2012, but it actually didn't tell anyone about it for nearly 2 years until October of 2014 during the midst of our investigation. It's a little troubling to think that a company was injecting information that can be used for targeted advertising to all its millions of customers without telling any of them about it for almost 2 years. When they did finally decide to disclose information about the program, Verizon claimed that the UIDHs were unlikely to be used other than as Verizon had intended as part of its advertising program. But what actually turned out is we found that, in fact, at least one of Verizon's own partners, a company called Turn, was at least one that was public. At least one of those partners used UIDHs to resurrect tracking cookies, effectively circumventing browser and operating system privacy protection. That is, consumers have the ability in their browser, for example, to delete a cookie, right? And we thought that was a way to protect privacy. But what the UIDH does is it allows the network level to begin to reassociate. Even if you delete the cookie, if it comes back and you still have the header traffic, you can take the information you had on the prior cookie, because it's the same header, and connect the two together, effectively mitigating the effect of deletions of cookies. We were also troubled that Verizon not only inserted the UIDH into its own subscribers' traffic, but into the traffic of non-Verizon customers who may have been roaming on the Verizon network as well, so that they were able to see where they were browsing and potentially target ads to them as well. We ended up happily settling this case earlier this year. We fined Verizon a modest fine, I would say, of $1.35 million. But the important point about this was not the fine. What we were able to garner as part of the settlement was that Verizon was going to be required to obtain opt-in consent before injecting UIDHs into HTTP requests to third-party websites. This was in addition to actually informing its customers that it was actually using this program, but it was important that those consumers opt into the program, that they not be opted in by Verizon and not told about it, but that they have the ability to make a choice before this information was provided to third-party websites. We also required Verizon to offer a choice to entirely withdraw from the UIDH program if you wanted to have nothing to do with it as a Verizon customer. And we prohibited them from injecting the UIDH into MVNO traffic. Really good settlement, we think, for all Verizon consumers, as well as for promoting privacy principles of transparency, of choice as well. The next cases that I want to talk about are a couple of data breaches that we've recently pursued as enforcement matters. Generally speaking, a telecom carrier has a responsibility to protect the confidentiality of customer information. We have similar provisions that apply to cable and satellite television providers as well, which are required to take all necessary steps to protect the security of customer information. In the last couple years, we've taken some pretty significant enforcement actions in the wake of some very serious data breaches. The first one that I want to talk with you about today involves AT&T. And here it's a fascinating case. So AT&T, like many companies in the United States, operates call centers outside of the United States. In this case, AT&T operated a call center in Mexico. And the way you ended up at the AT&T call center in Mexico is you dial AT&T from your phone to reach customer service. It says press 1 for English, press 2 for Spanish. If you press 2 for Spanish, then you got routed to the call center, may have been routed to the call center in Mexico. There were 3 call center representatives in Mexico who were being paid by a third party. In this case, his name was El Pelon. We believe that El Pelon is a Spanish moniker for a bald-headed man. El Pelon would provide those 3 customer service reps with telephone numbers, and those customer service reps then went into AT&T's systems and would obtain personal information about AT&T customers, their names, their partial social security numbers, which the customer service reps would then give back to El Pelon. Now, why might El Pelon want this information? Well, it appears as if El Pelon was trafficking in stolen, locked cell phones. And so El Pelon, who had these locked phones, wanted to get them out of whatever country he was in, Mexico, the United States, and ship them abroad where they could then be resold as unlocked phones. But to unlock the phone, you have to get a code from AT&T so that it can be unlocked. So El Pelon needed personal information about AT&T's customers, which he then used to go back to AT&T's website and enter the information to obtain the unlock code. El Pelon asked for information in the course of about 168 days from these 3 customer service reps for 68,000 AT&T customers. 68,000 records. One can only wonder over that 3-month period, how many calls did those customer service representatives take? You know, the chance that they were actually taking calls is quite slim. They were looking through records and getting paid by El Pelon. Well, El Pelon then actually used that information to access to submit unlock requests for over 280,000 AT&T customers. As we investigated this case and began to dig in further, we found that AT&T also operated a call center in Colombia. And it turned out that in Colombia, the managers actually found out that there were customer service representatives who were being paid to provide third parties with personal information about AT&T's customers. The managers called in those customer service representatives, they promptly fired them, and then the managers got in on the gig so that they could get paid for the information. We continued to investigate and found out that in the Philippines, on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, there were customer service representatives at another AT&T call center who were also being paid to provide information to third parties on AT&T customers. Overall, there were at least 30 to 40 customer service reps in these call centers in Colombia and the Philippines that were in on this. There were approximately another 300,000 AT&T customers that were affected by the breaches in the Philippines and Colombia. Given that none of the people were talking to each other, so it appears, in each of these call centers, we knew we had a massive compliance problem in the company. And we ended up settling this case with AT&T for $25 million. Importantly, we required better monitoring of what's going on in the call centers, better training for the call center representatives. One could only think that if AT&T limited the information that customer service representatives had access to, if they monitored where the vast number of records that they were going to, that they might have caught this a little bit earlier. Another case that we did recently involved Cox Communications, which is a fairly large cable phone and internet service provider in the United States. This was a case in which a member of the Lizard Squad hacking group, I don't know if we have any here in the audience today, but this one was Evil Geordie. Evil Geordie called up a customer service representative at Cox and said, hey, this is Joe from the IT department. I need you to go over to this website over here and enter your login information, your ID, your password. And of course, Evil Geordie was on the other side of the website. He suddenly had their login and password. At this time, Cox did not require multi-factor authentication, and therefore Evil Geordie was able to have all of the same access that a customer service representative had at this time. That was access to the personal information of all of Cox's 6 million or so subscribers. Evil Geordie then went into the Cox database, and he targeted a number of customers. He locked them out of their accounts. He changed their security question answers, and in fact, he even went to social media and found them on social media and harassed them, tried to embarrass them with information about their account. This was truly trouble and traumatic to them, and we ended up settling this case. It was for $600,000 as a fine, but more importantly, we wanted to make sure that there was multi-factor authentication in place. We wanted to make sure there was training that was put in place. And I tell you about these cases at a conference like Black Hat because the reality is that the vast majority of data breaches that we see, they look like this. They look like pretexting. They look like employees who were on the take or who were not being monitored. They're not all intrusions by outsiders who are finding a sophisticated way to get around the IT architecture. This is the reality. And so as we look at the vendors that are here, as we think about how to improve security and better protect privacy, we're really thinking hard not only about sophisticated attacks. Those are important. Cyber incidents are important. We're also just thinking about the basic ones, the vast majority that really get down to physical threats, that really get down to employee training. And we can't overemphasize that human error and human mistakes is a large part of the potential threat that's out there as well. Turn it back to Jonathan.
Thanks. So I'm going to talk about some of the work the Commission's done on Wi-Fi blocking. So this is a practice where you try to set up an access point, like a hotspot on your cell phone, or try to connect to an access point. It just doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because someone's messing with your network connection. And the law here is really very clear. It's a violation of federal law to willfully disrupt radio communications, period. So let me explain how the Wi-Fi blocking technology usually works. It can work in a variety of ways. This is the most common mechanism. So here's the sequence of requests and responses in connecting to a Wi-Fi network. So there's this flow from probing the network, then authenticating to the network, then associating with the network, and then finally application traffic can flow back and forth between your device and the Wi-Fi network. So this handshake happens, and ultimately you've got your connection established. Those frames that go back and forth to probe, to authenticate, to associate with a network, then ultimately to carry traffic, for the most part, don't have protection of any sort applied to them. There is part of the 802.11 standard that can be used to provide protection, but it's not widely deployed. And so the result is that someone can send frames for managing your connection that muck with your connection. And in particular, there's a well-known attack where you can send deauthentication frames. Deauthentication frames are just one of the many types of 802.11 frames to your device and cause it to get knocked off of a Wi-Fi network. If it tries to reconnect to that network, then send another deauthentication frame. And the net result is your connection to that network just isn't going to work. It's going to look like there's something wrong. So a fair amount of enterprise-grade network equipment has the ability to send deauthentication frames. That can have some very, very legitimate uses if you want to kick someone off of your own network. It gets a little more troubling if you're trying to kick someone off of another network. Now, managing your own network is very different from managing someone else's network. And there are a bunch of reasons why the FCC has been concerned about Wi-Fi blocking out in the wild. One is it thwarts competition in the ISP marketplace. So if you have the ability to choose between a hotspot you pay for and the Wi-Fi that's installed in a certain place, that's important competition. And if the hotspot is blocked, there's only one provider, there's less competition. Another important reason that comes to mind in the context of Black Hat is you might be in a place where you don't trust the Wi-Fi. And so you might want more secure wireless connectivity. You might trust your own hotspot running back over the cellular network more than the Wi-Fi at the location. You can't use your hotspot if your hotspot's blocked. Another reason to be concerned about this is folks paid for it. So if you've paid for your hotspot, you have a plan that includes one, you're prevented from benefiting from what you pay for on a monthly basis if that hotspot's blocked. And last, and again, certainly not least, it's just a total pain in the butt to figure out what's going on if there's Wi-Fi blocking, right? It seems like your hotspot's not working. It seems like you just kept getting dropped off of a network. And that's a waste of time. It might lead to finger pointing at the wrong people. So very, very difficult to identify and resolve what's going on. And don't just take the FCC's word for it that Wi-Fi blocking is a real pain. I think this might be the only time where the New York Times editorial board has chimed in on a specific Wi-Fi network management practice. They actually wrote an editorial about how hotels were deploying these Wi-Fi blocking technology, and they called it brazen. So that was their conclusion. We, for our part, investigated and have brought a few cases in this area. I want to focus on probably the most high-profile one against Marriott in late 2014. So Marriott was blocking Wi-Fi access points, including hotspots, at its hotels and their associated convention spaces. Marriott's business model here was it charged quite a bit of money for folks who wanted to have a booth at a convention and allow folks to connect, or wanted to manage a convention and have Wi-Fi for each visitor, in some cases charging up to $1,000 per device per day for internet connectivity at one of these locations. So again, competition pretty important in this space. So ultimately, the FCC settled with Marriott for $600,000 in fines and a compliance plan to make sure Marriott properties don't deploy this Wi-Fi blocking technology elsewhere. There have been other cases, again, relating to companies that manage convention spaces, providing IT services, and also other hotel locations. So the FCC has been very clear about the law in this area, and that you have a right to use your personal hotspot that you pay for. Let me touch on another area we've recently did some work in. In fact, just this week did some work in. And that's related to interference from wireless devices. So let me start with the legal principle here. So violation of federal law to market a wireless transmitter that can be easily modified to create interference. But it's important to note the limits of the FCC's interest here. The FCC's only interest is interference. Otherwise, modify away. The FCC has said again and again, it's a big fan of innovation. The whole point of the net neutrality rules is to promote innovation. And so, if it's lawful and someone wants to modify a device for their own interest, or to try to build a business model, or to do research, or because they're a hobbyist, again, and it's lawful, the FCC supports that freedom to tinker. So the agency, again, big fan of innovation. So this week, we announced a settlement with TP-Link, a major consumer Wi-Fi router vendor, related to a Wi-Fi router interference issue. The specifics of the issue were TP-Link was selling routers. We could go in, change the country code, and broadcast on spectrum that wasn't allocated for Wi-Fi in the US and could potentially cause interference. So we settled for a $200,000 fine and a compliance plan. But the really unusual part of this settlement agreement, and the part that was really particularly important to us and novel for the Commission, related to compatibility with open source firmware. So as a part of the consent decree, TP-Link is required to cooperate with the open source community and Wi-Fi chipset manufacturers to work on enabling support for third-party firmware on their routers. In our view, it was a win-win-win. It was a win for the Commission, because again, we're big fans of innovation and the freedom to tinker. It was a win for TP-Link, because they were going to work on a feature on their routers that a lot of consumers and businesses and researchers were demanding. And in turn, a win for those consumers, researchers, businesses, and so on, who would have access to another manufacturer of routers that would be compatible with firmware that they customized. So there's an example of kind of a long-standing area of law around radio interference, where the Commission is working hard to make sure its interest in innovation gets included into its enforcement work. Now I'm going to hand it back to Travis to talk about a decidedly not security and privacy issue related to unlimited data.
Well, before I go there, let me just say one other thing about Wi-Fi router interference. Since I am the chief law enforcement officer at the Federal Communications Commission, and this is Black Hat. I just have to emphasize that our desire to have people tinker, it does mean it still has to be lawful. I just have to put that part out there, that's what we're supporting is lawful tinkering. I don't want anyone to be confused about other potential ways that folks might tinker. But we're going to talk about unlimited data. Let me ask, I'm just wondering, anyone in here have an unlimited plan today or had one in the past? Oh, there's a lot of people. That's almost half the room. There are a number of so-called unlimited data plans that are still available in the market today. We have been concerned, at least in one instance so far, and I'm going to talk to you about that first enforcement action. There's a rule at the FCC that an internet service provider must provide its customers with accurate information about its service plans. And in this case, AT&T offered unlimited plans as early as 2007 surrounding the iPhone launch. And at that time, actually, AT&T had an exclusive deal with Apple that allowed it to be the only carrier in the United States to sell an iPhone. Millions. I mean, it was very popular. Millions of customers signed up for the AT&T unlimited data plan. And a few years later, as Verizon and others began to gain access to the iPhone and other smartphones rolled out, and as people started to become more reliant upon their data plans, AT&T instituted a policy of slowing down data after an unlimited plan subscriber, an unlimited plan, used 3 to 5 gigabytes of data in a month. And so here was a situation where if you were an unlimited plan subscriber, you had paid for a so-called unlimited plan, and you used more than 5 gigabytes of data, AT&T would slow the rest of your data down to 256 or to 512 kilobytes per second, regardless of whether there was any network congestion at all. This was troubling to lots of consumers. Thousands of them complained to regulators across the country. State attorneys general received complaints. The Federal Trade Commission received complaints. The Federal Communications Commission received complaints as well. They were concerned about the fact that consumers generally were concerned that they purchased an unlimited plan, and yet they didn't feel that they were getting high-speed, unlimited data. Also, AT&T didn't provide actual meaningful notice to subscribers when they were on a monthly basis approaching the cap or exceeding the cap. All of a sudden, you were just slowed down. In the course of our investigation, we learned that those customers whose data were slowed down to 256 to 512 kbps were slowed down on average 17 days per month. That means for those people that were slowed down over half the month on average, they were receiving this data that was so slow, the speed was so slow, you couldn't use the basic maps function on your smartphone. You couldn't use a video chat function like FaceTime. You couldn't use just basic activities that we expect and that we should be able to use when we're using our smart devices these days. Last year, the Commission charged AT&T with a $100 million fine. This is a matter that is ongoing right now, but it was the beginning of a process of beginning to look at least in this case, the apparent lawfulness of unlimited plans where there are actually limitations placed upon the data usage, and moreover, the extent to which disclosures need to be made to consumers to ensure that they have sufficient and accurate information about their plan so that they can make a meaningful choice between wireless providers. These are the recent enforcement actions that we've just chatted about today. The last category that we wanted to talk about are some of the works in progress that we have ongoing, and I'm going to pass this one back on to Jonathan.
So there are three areas that we've been working on that we want to highlight for you today. The first one, some new security expectations that the Commission has set for 5G wireless technologies. The second, dealing with robocalls. So you may get these from time to time on your phone. You know, sometimes no one ever talks on the other end. Sometimes it's someone claims to be from the IRS, someone from card member services. It's a real problem. And then the third, the security and privacy rules I touched on earlier, where the Commission was looking more closely at precise rules on those issues for Internet service providers. Travis is going to touch on what the Commission's proposed. So I'll start with 5G wireless. By way of technical background, 5G wireless technologies will likely, in part, operate on certain upper microwave spectrum that the Commission has just recently been setting up the licensing scheme for. So again, the Commission deals with radio and other RF issues. One of its important roles there is setting up licensing schemes for spectrum and conditions on operating on certain spectrum. And so this microwave spectrum that previously wasn't particularly useful for communications owing to recent advances now really is useful for communications. And so again, expectation 5G is going to use that in part. So part of the Commission's 5G proceeding related to security. And the Commission sought comment on what it should impose upon 5G service providers. Ultimately, the Commission set up a certification scheme, so beginning with getting information from companies that were going to be operating in the spectrum, providing these 5G services. And then the Commission said it's going to, in the near term, kind of move forward on 5G security and issue its notice of inquiry, which is kind of a pre-rulemaking document trying to gather information from stakeholders on the issue. So there's a certification process that got set up to get information. And in the course of the certifications, upper microwave operators are going to have to provide to the Commission some information about their security. And as part of providing that information, Commission's articulated some expectations around that security. So here's what the Commission said. That there's an expectation for these 5G providers that there's going to be protection for confidentiality, integrity, and availability of communications between a mobile device and the back-end network, between nodes on the back-end network that provide the wireless service, between one back-end network and another network, so routing security, and then for telephone, voice, and text message services between one mobile device and another mobile device. So it's an end-to-end security for those specific services. So those are the Commission's security expectations for 5G wireless. Now let me touch on robocalls, the top complaint, far and away, that the FCC receives. Just last month, Chairman Wheeler sent letters to the CEOs of the major telecom firms urging immediate action on robocalls. He made it very clear that he believes the industry holds a responsibility in addressing this problem, and he urged them to take action, and he asked for a reply detailing exactly what they were doing. And AT&T, in response, has agreed to lead a multi-industry strike force. It's going to be telecommunications firms and handset manufacturers and operating system vendors all working together to deliver immediate technical protections for consumers. This problem's gone on long enough. And there are a few specific directions that AT&T's, the group led by AT&T is focusing on. If you'd like to learn more, AT&T has a blog post about it. They're focusing on call authentication standards, so making sure that calls, particularly VoIP calls originating overseas, aren't going to get spoofed. They're focusing on how to build a do not originate list for certain sensitive numbers. So for instance, someone shouldn't be able to pretend to be from the IRS phone number. They're also working on standardizing compatible interfaces for sharing indicators and filtering robocalls. So the sort of notion there being that in the same way you've got a spam button for your email account, there should be a way in which you can share information, like a spam button, for your cell phone. So that's what the Commission's been up to of late, work in progress on robocalls. Now back to Travis to talk about the security and privacy rules.
All right. In the interest of time and wanting to leave some time for questions, I'm going to go very quickly on the security and privacy rules for ISPs. As we mentioned earlier, this year in March, the Commission released a proposed set of rules that would apply privacy and security protections to Internet service providers. We've long had similar rules provided to common carriers providing basic telephone service. But the proposed rules center around three basic principles. The first is transparency, and that's the idea that consumers should know what information their ISP is collecting about them, how that information is being used, and with whom it's being shared. It should also have sufficient and accurate information about the privacy and security practices of the provider. The second basic principle is choice. And this is the idea that consumers should have a meaningful, informed tools available to make choices about what information is collected and how it's used. And then the final category is security. And that's the idea that ISPs have a duty to protect the security and privacy of their subscribers. The proposed rule is currently under consideration by the Commission. The comments periods have now closed, and we are excited to hopefully bring this one to conclusion in the near future. With that being said, we've reached the end of our presentation. If there are any questions, and right now we'd be happy to take those from folks. Probably have time for two. Please.
Yes, I'm interested in the FCC's position on law enforcement indiscriminate use of stingrays and how privacy plays, and FCC's position on that.
So the question is about whether the FCC has taken a position on the use of stingrays by law enforcement.
Yes.
The answer is the FCC has not taken a position on that issue.
Okay.
That would be a decision for the Commission to make, but they have, as of now, they have not, and anything that's pending we don't comment on, or maybe pending. Yeah.
So the slide you just put up for security said ISPs must usually obtain opt-in.
Yeah, so I can discuss that.
Usually. So.
Yeah, so the question is, what does this slide in the privacy proposal, the line, mean about ISPs must usually obtain opt-in consent to repurpose data? So the way the proposed rule works is that if your ISP wants to use information that you provide to personal information to provide you the service, then it can do that it's deemed to have your consent to do that. That is, for you, think of a basic phone call. It's the easiest way to do it. For you to call from one number to the other, you have to share certain information with your telephone company. They have to know your phone number. They have to know the phone number you're calling. It's the only way they can provide the service to you. That information you're just deemed to consent so that you can actually just gain access. If your ISP wants to use that information to market other communication services to you, so from the company, so if I'm a Comcast or AT&T or Verizon, choose your company, and I want to offer you my own Comcast or AT&T or Verizon communication service, then I have to provide you the option to opt out of it. If I want to use it for any other purpose at all, if I want to share it with anyone, the way the proposal is written is it has to be opt-in. So depending upon the use, there's a different structure that applies, and that's why the word usually is written in there.
Okay, thanks. Does the FCC have an opinion about building structures that can prevent access to wireless networks? So for example, in this Marriott case, they were actively jamming. But let's say they built their conference center in 6-foot wall cement, or coated the walls with metallic paint. Would that be considered willfully interfering?
That is an interesting question. I imagine. So the question is whether physical actions that any individual or company might take to block cellular signal, for example, is a violation of an FCC rule or law. I imagine this may be motivated by the recent bar, I think, in the United Kingdom that essentially built a Faraday box around the bar so that people couldn't talk on the phone. It was in England, so I didn't actually have to consider the question, because there's one thing I know, which is that our jurisdiction does not go across outside of the United States. But the short answer is this is something that's new and innovative. We haven't thought about it yet, and so there's nothing publicly where we've taken a position on whether there is a law. Generally speaking, I will note that the laws usually, require willful or malicious interference.
Well, I mean, you could have plausible deniability. Oh, we need earthquake protection, or we just really like shiny walls in Vegas.
Yeah, that's true. And look, another example that could fall similar to that is there are some companies and restaurants, not public places, but that will tell you can't bring your phone in. Right? They'll just tell you, leave your phone outside. You can't bring it in at all. That's kind of a similar instance, and we haven't taken a position, although I have to admit that it's probably doubtful.
Thanks.
No problem. And unfortunately, we have no more time for questions, but Jonathan and I will be right outside the door and happy to chat further with anyone. Thank you very much for staying with us.